Bible names 12 tribes: Dan, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Ephraim, Manasseh. 12 families that came from one man, Jacob, who was later called Israel. These 12 tribes built a kingdom, lost it, got scattered, and then, according to history, disappeared. But they did not disappear. They moved, and where they moved tells you everything. Before we go deeper, understand this. The ancient Israelites were not the blind, blue-eyed people you see in most church paintings. They were from the Middle East and Northeast Africa. The land of Canaan, where they lived, sat between Egypt and what is now Syria. The people who lived there had brown skin, dark hair, and features that looked more like modern Ethiopians or Sudanese people than modern Europeans. This is not a theory. Ancient Egyptian art shows Canaanites and Israelites as dark-skinned people. The Bible itself, in the Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 5, records the speaker saying, "I am black and beautiful." In Lamentations 4, verse 8, it says their face had become blacker than soot. These are not metaphors. These are descriptions of people who looked African because they were from a region of the world that borders Africa. Now, here is where the history gets heavy. Around 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire under King Shalmaneser V attacked the northern kingdom of Israel. He broke through the walls, took the people, and deported them. The Bible says he took them to places like Hala, Heba, the river of Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. That is modern-day northern Iraq, Syria, and Iran. The two tribes of the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, survived longer, but in 586 BC, Babylon came and took them too. Then the Romans, in 70 AD, destroyed Jerusalem completely and scattered those who remained. 10 tribes went north and east. 2 tribes went into Babylon, and across centuries, some of these people kept moving, pushed by empires, by drought, by wars. They moved south, they moved west, they ended up in Africa. This is where the African connection starts to become undeniable. The tribe of Dan is one of the most documented cases. Early Jewish historians wrote that the Danites were a people who traveled far. In Ethiopia today, there is a community called the Beta Israel, the House of Israel. They are also called the Falasha, though many of them reject that name. These are black Jewish people who lived in the mountains of Ethiopia for thousands of years, practicing a form of Judaism that predates the Talmud. They kept the Torah, they observed the Sabbath, they practiced animal sacrifice before Yom Kippur, and they had no knowledge of later Jewish customs like Hanukkah, which tells researchers that their Judaism was ancient, cut off from the rest of the Jewish world before those traditions developed. Ethiopian oral tradition and their own religious texts, the Kebra Nagast among them, say they descend from the tribe of Dan. When Israel's law of return was being debated in the 1970s and 1980s, Israeli rabbinical authorities studied the Beta Israel extensively. In 1977, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, Ovadia Yosef, ruled that the Beta Israel were indeed descendants of the tribe of Dan and qualified for Israeli citizenship. Between 1984 and 1991, Israel conducted Operations Moses and Solomon, airlifting over 40,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel. These were black Africans being brought back to Israel on the basis of ancestral Jewish identity. That actually happened. It is documented history. The tribe of Manasseh has a similar story that takes you to West Africa and even further east. There is a community in northeastern India, the B'nai Manasseh, who claim descent from the tribe of Manasseh. They practice Jewish customs that their ancestors carried through oral tradition over centuries, including Passover rituals, circumcision, and the recitation of a prayer that explicitly references their origin as children of Manasseh. In 2005, Israel's Sephardi chief rabbi Shlomo Amma recognized them as descendants of a lost tribe and eligible to return under the law of return. Several thousand have since made Aliyah, the act of immigrating to Israel. But for our focus, let us go to West Africa. Historians and researchers, including Dr. Rudolph Windsor, who wrote From Babylon to Timbuktu in 1969, documented extensive migrations of Israelite communities across North Africa into sub-Saharan Africa over a period of centuries. Windsor traced the movement of Hebrews who, after the Assyrian and Babylonian dispersions, settled in Egypt, then moved into Ethiopia, then into Sudan, and then across the Sahel into West Africa. He found that many of the peoples of West and Central Africa have traditions, customs, and even words in their languages that trace back to Hebrew. The Igbo people of Nigeria are one of the most studied cases. The Igbo have traditions that parallel Israelite practices in detail that is hard to explain away. They practice circumcision on the 8th day, exactly as commanded in Genesis. They had a 7-day week with a day of rest. They had agricultural festivals that align almost exactly with Jewish holidays. A harvest festival in their tradition falls in the same period as Sukkot. A New Year celebration called Iwaji aligns with Rosh Hashanah. Their names are full of Hebrew roots. Eze means king, and the Hebrew Nasi means prince or ruler. The Igbo word for God, Chukwu, has parallels to discussions of the divine name in Hebrew tradition. Researchers like the late Dr. Catherine Achiloni documented these connections in detail. The Lemba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa are another case the world cannot ignore. For decades, the Lemba claimed they were Jewish people who came from a place called Sina, had a sacred priestly clan called the Buba, and practiced Jewish-style dietary laws. They did not eat pork. They practiced male circumcision. They had a sacred object they called the Nangalungandu, which they described as a container carried on poles that could kill those who touched it improperly. When researchers first heard this, they thought it sounded like a story. Then in 1999, geneticists from the University of London published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics. They tested the Y chromosome DNA of Lemba men, specifically their priestly clan, the Buba. The results showed that the Buba carried the Cohen model haplotype at a rate comparable to Jewish priestly families. The Cohen model haplotype is a genetic marker found in the Kohanim, the Jewish priestly class, who are direct descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. The Lemba's priestly clan had it. Black Africans in southern Africa were carrying the genetic signature of the ancient Israelite priesthood. The study made international headlines. The tribe of Gad has connections that run through North Africa. Ancient historians, including Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian who wrote extensively about the dispersed tribes, said some groups went into the interior of Africa. The Berber peoples of North Africa have communities that maintained Jewish practices for centuries before Islam came to the region. Some historians tie these communities to Gadite origins. The trans-Saharan trade routes are ancient, far older than most people realize, and people moved along them for thousands of years. The idea that Israelites crossed into sub-Saharan Africa is not a stretch. It is supported by the movement of goods, ideas, and genetics across those same roads. The tribe of Zebulun is connected in some traditions to the peoples of the Central African interior, communities that maintained oral histories of a migration from the north and east. Their naming conventions and certain ritual practices are studied by researchers looking at the spread of Israelite tradition across the continent. And then you get to what happened after all of this, the slave trade.
Between 1500 and 1900, between 10 and 12 million Africans were taken by force and shipped to the Americas. They came primarily from West and Central Africa. They came from the Igbo regions. They came from areas of Angola, Congo, Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria. They came from the exact areas where researchers have traced these Israelite migrations. the people who had already been scattered once, then scattered twice, then enslaved and carried across an ocean. Deuteronomy 28 is a chapter many black scholars point to. It is a list of blessings and curses. The curses section, starting at verse 15, describes what would happen to Israel if they turned away from God. It describes slavery. It describes being taken by ships. It describes a people scattered among nations who would never find rest. It describes poverty, oppression, and being sold to enemies. Many black scholars across denominations have read this chapter and said, "This sounds like us." This is not a fringe view. Dr. Yosef ben Yochanan, one of the most respected African historians of the 20th century, wrote extensively about the African roots of the biblical Hebrews and the historical connections between Black Africa and ancient Israel. John Henrik Clarke, whose lectures are still watched by millions, spent decades teaching African history and always included the African-Semitic connection as a part of that history. Sheikh Anta Diop, the great Senegalese scholar, wrote about the African origins of civilization and included the Afro-Asiatic world as a continuum, not a division. The reason this history gets suppressed is not complicated. Empire needs its subjects not to know who they are. A people who do not know their history are easier to rule. The transatlantic slave trade did not just take bodies, it took names, it took languages, it took family records, it took the oral traditions that held this history together. When you strip a people of those things across 400 years, you create a gap, and into that gap you put someone else's story. You tell people their history starts in chains, that everything before the ship is silence. But the silence is not empty. It is full of evidence. In the DNA studies, in the linguistic records, in the oral traditions that survived, in the practices that persisted across continents. The Lemba kept their priesthood genetics across thousands of miles and thousands of years. The Beta Israel kept their Torah in the mountains of Ethiopia without contact with the rest of the Jewish world, and when they were finally studied, their Judaism was found to be real, ancient, authentic. The tribe of Naphtali, in some traditions, is traced to communities along the eastern side of Lake Chad, deep in the African interior. Naphtali's territory in ancient Israel was in the north, and the tribe was described as swift like a deer. Some researchers connect the rapid migrations of certain Nilotic and Chadic peoples to movements that could trace back to these northern tribes. The evidence here is less definitive, but the pattern of migration matches. Ash's territory in ancient Israel was in the northwest, near the coast, a prosperous tribe known for olive oil and food. Some oral traditions in West Africa describe ancestors who came from a land of plenty near water. The coastal Yoruba and some Ghanaian traditions carry origin stories that describe a journey from the east or northeast across great distances to arrive at the coast where they settled. Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, also has claimed descendants among African peoples. Reuben's blessing in Genesis 49 describes a people who were unstable but vast. Some genealogical traditions among peoples of the Upper Nile carry the name Reuben in variations. These traditions are not widely studied in Western academia, but they exist in the oral records of communities in what is now Sudan and South Sudan. And Levi, the priestly tribe. Levi had no land inheritance in Israel because their inheritance was God. They were spread among the other tribes to serve as priests and teachers. This spreading out may explain why Levitical traditions appear in so many different African communities, not concentrated in one place, but distributed, the way a scattered priestly class would be. What you are looking at when you look at all of this is not a neat, clean story. History never is. Some of this is well documented with genetics and archaeology. Some of it lives in oral tradition and comparative cultural study. Some of it is still being researched, but the broad outline is real. Black people in Africa and the diaspora have ancestral connections to the ancient Israelites. That connection is biological, cultural, and historical. The Beta Israel flew to Israel. The Lemba's DNA was tested and confirmed. The Bnei Manasseh were recognized by the Israeli rabbinate. These are not myths, they are documented events. What does this mean practically? It means the story of ancient Israel is not separate from Black history, it is part of it. The same people who built empires along the Nile, who crossed the Sahara, who created the kingdoms of Mali and Songhai, who populated West Africa and got carried in chains to the Americas, those people include the descendants of the 12 tribes. The story did not end in 722 BC when Assyria attacked. It continued. It crossed deserts and oceans. It survived slavery and colonialism. It is still being pieced together by scholars, by DNA labs, by communities who never stopped knowing who they were even when the world told them they were nothing. History has a habit of coming back. You can't scatter a people so completely that they forget everything. Blood remembers what the mind forgets. The tribes did not vanish. They walked into Africa, built civilizations, survived empires, and kept going. And the world is only now, slowly, starting to understand what that means.